The trade deadline is done. The team building thinking is not for the Indiana Pacers. What moves can they still make for the rest of the season with the trade deadline passed to help themselves this season and beyond? We'll break it all down today and other trades that impacted the Pacers this year on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Monday, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we're wrapping up the trade deadline by looking at, not trades for a lot of the show, looking at transactions the Pacers can still do for the rest of the season. Yes, the trade deadline has passed. That does not mean transactions are done. Signings could happen, waivers could happen, contract conversions could happen, extensions can happen, all sorts of stuff. That's worth discussing, as it could help the Pacers now. It could help them in future seasons. It could set themselves up to make other moves in future seasons. I'll cite examples of them doing this under the current front office regime, so you can understand the context of each kind of move as we push through it. At the end, we'll really wrap up the trade deadline by looking at other trades not involving the Pacers that I think kind of impact the Pacers this year and potentially in future seasons. Then we're back to normal coverage. We've already talked about 2 games since the deadline, but it's been buried in lots of important trade coverage. If you want to hear more on the Warriors game, we did that last Friday, more on the Knicks game yesterday, and Doug McDermott talk with Noah Magaro George was also yesterday. Today is a lot of transactional information. Important stuff, I think, to discuss as this season progresses, looking at the stuff the Pacers can do for the rest of this season. Let's start at the top of the list. This one took a hit with Buddy Hield being traded away specifically, but there are still players who can have their contract extended with the Pacers between now and the end of the season. It does not mean it's likely to happen, but it's something that could happen, or something that at the bare minimum at least needs to be discussed as a possibility. Of the 14 players currently on the Pacers roster, 2 of them are eligible for a contract extension between now and the end of the season. One is Pascal Siakam, who's eligible for a 2-year, $81.5 million extension. I'm glad I said those numbers out loud so you can hear them and never need to think about them again. There is zero chance Pascal Siakam would agree to such an extension. With his free agency coming up as an unrestricted free agent, he can make way more money over way more time. That makes no sense for him to do. He's not going to take that. I'm just checking off a box to say I talked about it. Why would he take it when he can make more than that in the first and second year of an extension and be longer? That doesn't mean he's going to not be with the Pacers, but he's not going to sign an extension before the season ends. There is a second player on the Pacers who's contract extension eligible. Their second guy used to be Buddy Hield. He's gone. But their new guy, Doug McDermott, is actually sort of extension eligible with the Pacers right now. He can't sign the veteran extension he could have had with the Spurs, but he's still eligible for an extension with the Pacers. And funnily enough, it is interesting. It actually fits within parameters that would make sense for 32-year-old Doug McDermott. I've been all over the place getting his age wrong in recent days. 32-year-old Doug McDermott, who does not have a birthday until 2025. So he'll be 32 this whole year. Anyway, he is eligible after this trade for a 2-year extension up to $29.6 million at a max. I don't think Doug McDermott is worth that much money, which is to say there is an extension that I think fits within what his market value would be that is possible, and for only 2 years at his current age maybe makes some sense. And if he got 2 years, he could be extension eligible again at the end of that new deal, but it would be during the season. Either way, I don't know what Doug McDermott's market value is perceived to be, right? Before this season, it was probably pretty close to the MLE, right? He's still a double-digit scorer with the Spurs, shooting over 40% from 3. This year, with his numbers down, I'd be curious what his value is perceived to be as a good shooter who is kind of limited in other ways. But I don't think it's 2 years, almost $30 million. I do think that means the Pacers could, in theory, if Doug McDermott was amenable to a 2-year extension, get him to sign something if they wanted him. I don't know that they do or do not. But for example, looking back at last year's free agency, just to name a player, George Niang, 30 years old, signs with the Cavs on a 3-year, $25.5 million deal. So $8.5 million per season for Georges Niang. Is Doug McDermott better than Georges Niang right now? Maybe not. Jeff Green, $8 million a year. Trey Lyles, $8 million a year. I don't know if Doug McDermott's quite at the level of those players. Maybe he's pretty close, though. That is the kind of range that sounds good. And so if you think Doug McDermott's worth 2 for 16, 2 for 18, 2 for 14, 2 for 20, if you think he's great, whatever number you think it is, he is eligible for that right now with the Pacers. It cannot be longer than 2 years. It can be shorter, though. And it can't start at more than a little over 14 million, about 14 and a half. So those are the 2 extensions the Pacers can do the rest of the season. You can toss the fact that you have that Siakam knowledge out the window. It's not going to happen, but you should register that McDermott one, not because I think it's necessarily going to happen, but because it's possible and actually makes sense. Like, as a free agent, what is Doug McDermott going to get? Is he really going to get much longer than a 2-year deal at his age, right? Especially after a strange season he's having right now. Statistically, maybe he is, and maybe that's worth holding out for him. But if he gets enough money that he feels like it's worth it, and maybe he thinks he can get paid again at 34, perhaps that's something that makes sense. Although if you're the Pacers, you probably don't want to do that until you've seen McDermott play 10, 15 games with your team. So I'd imagine that this would not happen until March-ish, just so they have some sample size with McDermott, if it even happens at all. And by that point, who knows if they just want to just not wait till the season's over anyway. But it is possible. It is within restrictions that make sense for McDermott's market value. And so if any Pacers extended before the season ends, it will be Doug McDermott. Thing 2 on the moves the Pacers can make before the season ends, very generally, sign somebody. Sign a player. How about that? They do have an open roster spot after their trades. They entered trade deadline day with 14 players. Then they traded away Buddy Hield, and they had 13 players. They got Corey Joseph and Furkan Korkmaz to get to 15. They waived both of them. And then they get James Johnson and Doug McDermott. There you go. That's how you end up plus 1 player to go from 13 to 14. They have an open roster spot, which means they can just sign somebody. And that alone is a good starting point of like, hey, you can do lots of stuff with that. So something fascinating for the Pacers is that they started this season under the salary cap, and teams under the cap get something called the room exception, right? Teams over the cap, you've probably heard people talk about the MLE, the mid-level exception. There's 2 versions of that. Teams under the cap get something called the room exception, which is for about $7.7 million in the first year this year, although it can be up to 3 years in length. Pacers haven't used it, and they're over the cap now, but they still have that room exception. It's still something available to them this season. Now, I don't think there's any free agents out there right now who are currently worth even close to $7.7 million per season, because that's generally like a good player, someone who should be on a team, right? But that still is a tool the Pacers have for the buyout market to potentially beat other offers. For example, Spencer Dinwiddie just signed with the Lakers on a deal using part of the Lakers mid-level exception that is better than him just signing for the minimum, right? So because of that, they had an advantage over other teams that maybe could only offer the minimum. Tristan Thompson, if you remember, got the BAE from the Bulls after he was bought out by the Pacers a few years ago, right? So there is some intrigue you can have in the buyout market by being able to offer more money. Usually in the buyout market, there's 2 things players are looking for, maybe 3. Opportunity to play. That's how the Pacers got Wes Matthews a few years ago. We'll talk more about the buyout market in a second. Money, which the Pacers can offer now, or chance at a ring, and they can just be on the team. There's a lot of those. And who knows what the buyout market ends up forming as. There's been some waivers in recent days that have been pretty interesting. There's some vets out there who are solid players, and we can talk about that in a second. But I think that is, from a tool perspective, the Pacers open roster spot, something extremely valuable that they could do. The other tool that they have, they've really had this since January 5th, and they've used 2 of them already on James Johnson, is they can sign someone to a 10-day deal. And I have an explanation on why I think that's particularly valuable that I will talk about in just a second. But a 10-day contract is exactly what it sounds like. It's a contract for 10 days. Those offer a lot of flexibility because they end and they can be waived in the middle of them for a minimal penalty instead of being a rest of season deal or instead of carrying a significant cap hit. So those are valuable tools. So the Pacers financially, with their open roster spot, they're far from the tax, they're far from any apron, but they're over the cap. So these tools are valuable to them. They allow them to have some flexibility to add to their team. We can talk about some players in a second, but I want to talk about some actual interesting uses of that roster spot using some of the tools and some other moves the Pacers can still make this season. Coming up here in segment 2, yes, actual potential names. But before we do any of that, we are going to talk about the lovely folks over at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals. It makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else, and LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many qualified candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and may not have the time or resources to hire, so they're constantly finding ways to make it an easier process. And they even just launched a new feature that helps you write job descriptions, making it even quicker and easier. 2.5 small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Yours could be next. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And we are back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, how about some not basketball? Locked On Chiefs or Locked On 49ers. Wrap up your NFL season with those two shows. Hear more about the Super Bowl. If you want to hear from the winners, obviously the Chiefs are the way to go. Pat Mahomes is so much fun to watch. Man, he is too tough to beat. Really fun game. It was really boring for me, at least, as a common football watcher for a while. But once the scoring got going in the second half, that was a great game. I really enjoyed the halftime show. I'm sure you're all dying to know my opinion on Usher. I'm sure many people didn't like it. And now we continue to talk about the Pacers and their transactional decisions for the rest of the season. So I'm going to start using some examples of some of the stuff that they could do in terms of signing somebody, especially with the buyout market available as an option. But there's lots of other stuff to do. For example, if they did a 10-day contract with like a Mad Ants player, that's something they've done after or around the trade deadline in past seasons. Think, for example, O'Shea Brissett in the Nate Bjorkgren season. He got a 10-day after the trade deadline and did really well. They needed him down in Houston for his first game. He played all right. They needed him again. He played all right. He got a second 10-day, played it in every game on that deal, and proved that, hey, this is an NBA level player, and he stuck around on that contract, right? Sometimes those 10-day deals are about trying to get someone to prove that they can belong on your team long-term. O'Shea Brissett certainly did that. Steph Hicks got a 10-day. I think this was after the trade deadline a few years ago. Didn't appear in a game, right? Trey McKinney-Jones got a 10-day from the Mad Ants a few years ago, appeared in one game for like a minute, right? Sometimes you don't hear about the guy again. Sometimes they turn out to be a hit and someone worth, continuing to look at or continuing to keep around and seeing what they can do. If they're going to promote a Mad Ants player specifically, Kyle Mangus has been playing well for Fort Wayne. They have Elfrid Payton and Jordan Bell who have played well all season. Those would be the standout names to me. I've always thought Pedro Bradshaw was pretty good. Craig Sword, who has NBA experience, who's had an all right season down there. They have a lot of guys who are worthy, in theory, and they promote Mad Ants a lot in the past. But think about O'Shea Brissett types when you think about Pacers using a 10-day deal. Buyout market. Pacers have done this 2 times, I believe, in the Kevin Pritchard-led front office. In theory, more than that. But the 2 standouty ones to me are 2 that came for different reasons. One that came for the Pacers being good, and not necessarily a huge role, but they offered him solid money and a role that he could play. Trevor Booker, in the first 2017-18 season, he was their bench 4 for the postseason that year. And then the year Oladipo got hurt, the following year, Wesley Matthews was a buyout guy. And that one was all about the role, right? He could start, right? And he ended up playing decently enough and got other opportunities. I think he was on the Knicks the next season. I can't quite remember, but that is what the buyout market can allow you to do. And we've already seen a lot of the buyout market starting to form. That doesn't mean it's done. That's what I think people are missing. I keep seeing a lot of who can the Pacers sign a buyout market tweets from people asking me. And I understand the question. I don't want to say it's silly to ask right now, but it's hard to say. Like, more stuff could happen. More waivers can happen. We've already seen so many of them. Victor Oladipo, he's not going to play this year, got waived, but like Daniel House is kind of a quality player who can play a backup couple positions. Killian Hayes, Joe Harris, Harry Giles, like a ton. Spencer Dinwiddie already signed with the team. Kyle Lowry just got let go. I'm missing a bajillion of these. Frank Ntilikina got waived. Furkan Korkmaz, obviously, although the Pacers are not bringing him back. Kevin Knox, who's in a little better now. Danilo Gallinari. I could go on and on. Thad Young, former Pacer. Like, there's a bunch of guys who could make sense, and there could be more coming, right? So it's impossible to say specifically what the Pacers need, right? They played McDermott against the Knicks for 7 minutes. And beyond him, they still have Shepard, they still have Walker. Like, they can't offer, unless someone like Awesome, who's clearly better than Doug McDermott or even maybe another bench position. But like, why would that player be getting waived? If someone awesome comes available, yeah, they have the resources to get them, and they should try to upgrade their team. But like, they can't offer, a ton of opportunity. That's what makes their spots interesting. So maybe they look to shore up depth at a spot that they could need more for the postseason, and that's where the wing always stands out, right? You always want to be, if there's an injury in the playoffs or leading up to the playoffs, you always want to feel good about who you're trotting onto the floor. And so maybe another wing in case your rookies aren't ready at the 2, 3, 4 spots, aka Ben Shepard and Jarris Walker, could be something worth exploring. If you're the Pacers, obviously good wings don't just become available all of a sudden. So maybe they just look for vets, but like, if someone interesting enough, like, I think Daniel House is an okay player. He's maybe not quite at Doug McDermott's level, but he can defend a little bit. Like, he's fine. He would make sense to me if he was willing to take a role, take the Pacers' money. And maybe they do both of the things I've already talked about now in tandem. That's one advantage of what I just talked about, is the deadline for players to get waived by their current team and be eligible for the playoffs with another team is March 1st. That's still, as me talking, it's a leap year. So that's 17 days away, right? So you can sign a guy even after the All-Star break ends. The All-Star break ends that Thursday after the All-Star break's the 22nd. Like, you could sign a guy to a 10-day pretty much, during the All-Star break, let it ride out and end on that 29th, and then sign a buyout guy. You could do those things in tandem with your team if you wanted to try to explore somebody and then try to get somebody else, or do any number of things, right? So the buyout market's still forming. It's not done. But there are some, Daniel House, Joe Harris, names I've already mentioned. Like, there's some interesting, Joe Harris might be washed, but there's some interesting-ish guys who could be out there who might make some sense, although they got waived for a reason in a lot of their cases. So we'll see what that ends up forming to be. I haven't looked at a list of who still makes sense as maybe a buyout candidate. A lot of them went really early this year, and for some reasons that was pretty smart. But either way, that is something to monitor for the Pacers the rest of the way, and they've had decent enough success with that. They can always sign somebody to a minimum deal, right? The room exception may not be necessary, although it is a nice tool to have for the Pacers. I mean, you can offer more money than another team if you need to use it. James Johnson's gotten post-trade deadline minimums the last 2 years. Terry Taylor, I think he came out of the MLE. But a lot of guys have been signed post-trade deadline for every team in the NBA with the minimum deals who need it, because any team who has space on the roster can use minimums. The Pacers could convert a two-way deal down the stretch of the season. Speaking of Terry Taylor, he was on a two-way that got promoted. Dwayne Washington, similar, got promoted. Let's see, who else? Alex Poythress got a two-way promoted, although that was before the trade deadline the year it happened for him. Edmund Sumner had his two-way promoted. That was after the trade deadline, barely after they waived Jalen LeCue. They've done this a lot. And Kendall Brown's been around the Pacers more often recently. I don't know that they would want to convert his deal and have him be the 15th roster spot, but maybe, right? Maybe they do, and then they'd have an open two-way. He's been better this year as a shooter and play finisher, and he's a wing who's athletic. Like, maybe they want to explore him, right? That is an option they have, and they would have, again, an open two-way slot. Think, Gabe York, during past year conversions. For example, he got one spot when Dwayne Washington got converted. Nate Hinton got one when Terry Taylor got converted. Amita Brima got one after the trade deadline, although someone got waived for that one. Ben Moore, I think, got Alex Poythress' two-way spot. So there's a lot of ways that guys can slide into those roles. That's also something the Pacers can still do this season. Two ways, their deals are guaranteed, but they're fairly easy to waive from a cap impact. So between the two ways, between the 10 days, between the buyout market, there's always stuff they can do. They can also buy out somebody in theory if they wanted to save some money and open a roster spot, but really no one makes any sense as a buyout candidate on this Pacers team. They're either young and valuable, or they're a vet who they want to have back. Ironically, the best buyout candidate on the Pacers is Doug McDermott, which I doubt it. I mean, if he's not playing at all, I guess. But I guess with the information we have right now about how the Pacers feel about Doug McDermott, I would imagine that they're not going to buy him out. But I suppose if it's just a terrible fit, that as the rest of the month goes, maybe they could. He's the only one that makes any sense. But I don't expect the Pacers to be buying someone out. I expect they could be a team that gets another wing-ish or guard-ish, wing-ish player on the buyout market. But lots of stuff could happen, and we will see. If anything were to happen really soon, right? Like this week or really early in the All-Star break, I would imagine it would be a 10-day deal, add some depth or just get a look at somebody first, and then they go to the buyout market. But that's like the most optimal thing, I suppose, but it costs the most money. So do they really, who knows what they want to do or how they want to manage all of that. But that is moves the Pacers can still make the rest of the season. I'm not saying anything's particularly likely in terms of an extension or a signing or any sort of tweaking at the back end of their roster with their two ways, but they've always done something, right? I think I named last year with the two ways. Before that, it was Shea Brissett. Before that, it was Edmund Sumner's conversion and some buyout guys. Like almost every year, they've done something after the trade deadline before the end of the season. It makes sense to if it optimizes your team for this year or beyond. So we'll see if they find anything that makes sense, but there is stuff they can do and stuff worth keeping an eye on. And especially in the case of McDermott specifically, since he's kind of involved in a lot of that, seeing how he plays and fits. And then in general, if he's a very, poor playing, they need another wing. If he's playing great, what kind of stuff could they approach? Does that make them more likely to just grab a vet on the buyout market? Who knows? Lots of stuff we'll learn more about in the coming games. Let's wrap up trade deadline coverage by looking at other trades that I think impact the Pacers this season and potentially beyond. There's not that many this year, ironically enough. Kind of a strange trade deadline in that way. So lots more to talk about before we do any of that, though. We are going to talk about Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Well, our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level, like the 2024 Nissan Rogue. Perfect for city drives and great escapes. Class exclusive Google built-ins is your always updating assistant. You can call it for almost anything right there in the Nissan Rogue. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store all built right into the HD touchscreen information system in the Nissan Rogue, 12.3 inches. And it's perfect. It's the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. There's also the 2024 Nissan Armada. It will change what you expect from a full-size SUV. Picture a rugged 4x4 that can seat up to 8 in first-class luxury and style. Tow bigger and explore further. With the 2024 Armada, take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check it out at shopnissanusa.com. And we are back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, 2 recommendations. Locked On Knicks, who the Pacers played on Saturday. Talked all about that game on yesterday's show already, if you missed that. And Locked On Hornets, who the Pacers played tonight. Not getting into much Hornets today because the Pacers just played them. They're not a very good team, although they look different. And they actually, I believe, won their first game out of the trade deadline. They've got a bunch of new players. So Locked On Hornets can tell you about the new look Hornets, who maybe are a little better and not as much of a pushover as the old look Hornets, but still a game the Pacers should win. And you've just seen the Pacers play them if you listen to the show every single day. Let's wrap this up looking at other trades that I think are relevant to the Pacers, something they saw and maybe registered. Well, the place to usually start with this is, the reason this matters, and this is relevant to every trade deadline, is who's around the Pacers in the standings, right? What did they do? Because, the seeding chase, the buyers versus sellers debate leading up to the trade deadline, all those factors usually defines what teams do, right? Who's a buyer is based on who's good. Who's a seller is who's bad or who's not going in the right directions, right? So who around the Pacers made a trade? They're decently far out. I mean, I guess they're only 3.5 games out of 4th. That's pretty far, though. But they're also, 4.5 games ahead of ninth. The Pacers are pretty firmly, I'd say, out of the top 4 in the East, but also pretty firmly out of the bottom play-in. They're pretty clearly in this 5 through 8 range, which used to be 6 through 8. But the Sixers lost Joel Embiid and won 2 out of 10, and now all of a sudden they're in this tier as well. So the Pacers are 2 games behind the Sixers, half a game ahead of the Magic, 1.5 ahead of the Heat, who had injuries and sadness for Jimmy Butler on Sunday. So they are all 5 fallen to 8th, and the Magic are now in 7th, half a game behind the Pacers. So what's relevant in that tier? What trades did those teams make? Well, the Magic didn't do anything. They are in a weird spot where they're super young. They're really in a season of discovery, and they're good already. Holding them off might be one of the stories of the final stretch for the Pacers. Can they hold off the Magic, or can they catch the Sixers? The Magic were the only team in that group of 4 that did nothing on the trade front this year. That is noteworthy in and of itself. If the Pacers moves at the deadline don't sink them too much, they should be able to stay in front of the Magic. They got Pascal Siakam, obviously, but they traded away Buddy Hield. So They are a better team than they were 3 weeks ago, and they will hope that that's enough to hold off the Magic because the Heat made their move. They traded with the Hornets a couple weeks ago as well. This wasn't really a deadline trade, but it's still a trade that happened. And they got Terry Rozier. They got Terry Rozier from the Hornets for a first-round pick. So that was their upgrade. They traded one of their last available assets to do so. They're 8th in the East right now, but they are more talented. Perhaps that Rozier trade helps. The Sixers made one trade. They made multiple trades actually, but they made one trade, and you all know exactly who it is. It's Buddy Hield. Buddy Hield is on the Sixers. That's something so interesting about that trade for the Pacers is they traded Buddy Hield to the team right in front of them in the standings. Buddy Hield and the Sixers get their first win post deadline Saturday. I think it was Saturday. They beat the Wizards. So they are doing their thing, I guess. 2-8 in their last 10, though, still. But they got better. They wanted him. They gave up picks to get him. He'll fit well there. And that matters for the Pacers as they're chasing that team. Now, obviously, with Joel Embiid out for a long time, they're going to need Tyrese Maxey to be amazing, and maybe Maxey and Hield can be a wonderful offensive backcourt for Philly. But, if they're harder to catch because of that trade, that is, of course, noteworthy for the Pacers. That's it for that tier because the other Sixers moves were sell moves. They traded Daniel House away. They traded him to the Pistons in their quest to get under the luxury tax. They traded Patrick Beverley away. I actually think that one is a trade that impacts the Pacers. This was on my list of looking through the list of stuff that could impact Indiana. Patrick Beverley on the Bucks, which matters because in theory, the Bucks could be the Pacers' first-round opponent. If the playoffs started today, as of me talking, they would be in the 6-3 series, which is fascinating. Not the 2-7 like many thought when these teams were playing all the time in late December, early January. Either way, the part of those series with the Pacers dominating the regular season series is their guard play was always really good, right? Haliburton had some big games in the in-season tournament and even one, I think, I can't remember which one of the three after it was really good. But TJ McConnell had good games against the Bucks. Ben Mathurin has like 2 of his best 4 games this season against Milwaukee. Right, their guard play has been good against the Bucks, and some of that's just the Bucks defense just hasn't been that good this year. Some of it at the point of attack, a lot of it in transition, and that allowed the Pacers, who are great in transition and have smart guards, to have success against that team. If they add Patrick Beverley, right, he's a big factor there. Dame and Malik Beasley and Pat Connaughton and Cam Payne, not a good defensive group of guards. They sent Cam Payne to Philly in that Patrick Beverley trade. Perhaps that actually means a lot for the Bucks, right? Culture setter, defensive toughness, like that could matter to them, I think. And if it helps them in the matchup with the Pacers, that is, of course, extremely relevant. Like he was a big boost for the Bulls last year in their guard room. So I actually think that trade could matter, especially if the Pacers end up meeting the Bucks in the postseason. That was the only trade the Bucks made at the trade deadline. And just looking at the teams Pacers could play in the first round, the Celtics, they made some small upgrades. Xavier Tillman in the door. They traded away Delano Banton, and I can't remember the third guy they got, but they made a couple moves. They got a little bit better. The Cavs did not do anything. The Knicks obviously have been an awesome trade team this year. Bojan Bogdanovic, Alec Burks, OG Anunoby, they got better. So 3 of the top 4 got into the arms race, and they're tougher to beat. And potentially the Bucks got a good fit to specifically play the Pacers. Knicks, of course, got better as well. But teams within the Pacers timeline is usually where I go to end this. Teams around the Pacers in the East that are also ascending. But that's just the Magic. The Raptors are now a couple years behind those teams. The Hornets, Wizards, and Pistons are a couple years behind those teams. And the other teams in their kind of range of record are all either older or not currently ascending. So I think a lot of the trades that impact the Pacers the most are teams around them in the standings right now in terms of the playoff pursuit, and teams on the other side of the bracket of what could be the first round of the playoffs that could impact who the Pacers play in the first round. The Pacers got the Raptors' second-round pick, probably. The Raptors traded for Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji, so maybe they'll be a tiny bit better, and that pick could end up being a little worse. I think it was 36 the day of the trade, and it's already 38. Pacers will hope it remains in the 30s in terms of value and getting, perhaps a rosterable non-two-way player with that pick. I think that also matters to them. And they traded away their worst second, so they'll hope one of the Bucks, Cavs, Pelicans, or all of them really are pretty good to close the season, and the pick they gave away isn't particularly strong. Those are the trades that I think impact the Pacers the rest of the season and perhaps beyond, depending on how the draft stuff shakes out. And that is it for Pacers transactional coverage. Next time we talk about Pacers moves, it's because something happened. Maybe if it gets close to March 1st and we get a good sense of what the buyout market could look like and the Pacers still have an open roster spot, we can talk then about what they should do, if anything, with that spot. But as it stands right now, Pacers have a team. It makes sense. Their depth chart makes sense, and they will be living with it. Tomorrow, we will talk whatever happens in Charlotte for Pacers Hornets. Can they get a 2-game win streak going? What does it mean? And then as this week progresses, would like to do 2 shows with a guest, maybe a Raptors U1, to talk with someone who covers the Raptors about Siakam's new look with the Pacers and how Bruce Brown and Jordan Ward doing with Toronto for a little bit, looking at that game, looking ahead at the All-Star break. Lots of stuff coming to Indy specifically. They play the Raptors. We'll talk about that game. Lots of fun stuff still coming on the actual basketball front. And then next week, we'll talk All-Star. And then we got to get to the mailbag eventually. I have not done one in forever. The Pacers haven't had like a lot of time off in terms of like 2 or 3 day gaps between games this season. So not a good chance to hear from you guys and what you want to hear about. So that could come next week. Don't give me questions yet. Wait, if we're going to do that. But lots coming. Lots of fun stuff coming. Hope you had a wonderful weekend and got to enjoy it and spend some time with family and do fun things and watch the Super Bowl. I enjoyed that as well. Back tomorrow talking Pacers, Hornets, and plenty more. Till then, everybody have a wonderful day. We will see you soon.